Welcome to this series on conducting a successful scoping review project. This is the third part or the third video of this series. Today we'll be talking about screening and selecting evidence. Obviously, once we've run the searches across all the different databases to find the evidence, now we need to deal with that mountain of evidence and sift through it. And hopefully today's video will highlight some of the steps to take in order to successfully and effectively manage that pile of evidence. So today we'll be looking specifically at using a tool called Covidence. It's a subscription-based tool that we're fortunate enough to have here at the University of Ottawa. You can use this tool to streamline a few steps in the process. We'll talk about creating a project in the Covidence environment, importing references, setting up pilot tests, and also evaluating titles and abstracts as well as the full text through that system, and then also talking quickly about steps for resolving conflicts. As I mentioned, Covidence is one of many different tools that exist to help with the different steps of systematic review projects. Obviously, I mentioned systematic reviews, but any type of review project, including obviously scoping reviews as well. As I said as well, it is a subscription-based tool. Therefore, you can not just turn to Covidence without having an affiliation or a subscription to the service itself. It is online. It's not software that you download, but a website that you access, and everything's done through the Covidence website. And we'll take a moment this afternoon to really go through that and look at these different the different functionality in the system itself. So what the idea behind Covidence and other tools around systematic or scoping reviews is to simplify certain steps of the process. What I also like about Covidence, we've had it now for a number of years, and it's always constantly being improved. And so as you go through different projects over time, you'll see new improvements and new features getting added to Covidence, which again, just help simplify certain steps of the process. One of the limitations I find with Covidence that it is built around systematic reviews. So when you're looking at certain features or functions, sometimes they don't always translate nicely to scoping reviews, but all in all, it's really a great tool to use. As I've mentioned, there are different steps that can be streamlined by using tools like Covidence, most notably the title and abstract screening. That's a step that obviously requires a lot of time, and using a tool like this will help simplify that process by a large margin of time. Also, in terms of assessing the full text, we'll talk a bit about that as well today, and data extraction, which is a step we'll talk about in the next video, but data extraction can also happen in the Covidence environment. So first and foremost, once you have created an account with Covidence, you can then go in and create a new project. And when you start a new project, this is the first page that you'll be looking at. And here you'll be answering these few different questions or providing this information around your review. So in most cases, you're probably not doing a Cochrane systematic review. In the context of our series, we're working on scoping reviews. So we'll choose no, which is already pre-selected as the default, but you can identify if you are working on a Cochrane review. You can provide a name for your review. If you have a long list of reviews that you're working on, this might be helpful to have a name that's pretty descriptive so that you can easily find it later. You can then choose from a drop-down list of different review types. So in this example, I chose the scoping review. And you also have question types. And a lot of these are, again, built more around systematic reviews. So I, in this case, chose other. And instead of specifying the question type at the very bottom of the screen, I just wrote in the question that might lead this particular review. Once the review is created or your project is created, you then have the option to set a lot of different parameters in your project. And we'll walk through from left to right, from review settings to study tags, these different features. And I'm going to skip over a few of these, but I want to highlight in the review settings a few options that might be helpful, especially if you're working on a project on your own. So as we've discussed in the previous videos, it's often recommended that at least two reviewers, work on the title and abstract screening, work at reviewing the full text, and also assist with data extraction. Now, this won't always be possible. So in teams or in situations, where you find yourself as the solo researcher, perhaps as a student, for instance, where you can't recruit anyone else to help you, you might want to go into the settings and change these default parameters that are set to 2 for each of these phases: screening, full text review, and data extraction. You might want to change that to 1. And so that means that instead of requiring 2 reviewers per title and abstract, you become the solo person reviewing those titles and abstracts. We'll talk a bit more about the differences between the 2 extraction forms in the next video, but that's also something you can choose. As you can see here in the quick definition, the extraction 2 is probably more suitable in the context of a scoping review. In that case, that's maybe one type of extraction form you want to use. Again, we'll address more about extraction in the final video of this series. As we move through, we look at the second tab under reviewers. This is where you can send out invitations for others to join your review project. And so in the Covidence environment, you can set up your review and then add additional people. Now, these additional people that you'll recruit, they can obviously be affiliated to the same university, but they can also be affiliated to other universities that do not have a Covidence subscription. So you can invite people who aren't able to access Covidence through a subscription, so they can't create a review, but they can join a review from an institution where there is a subscription. So in our case, we can invite people from other institutions to join our reviews, and they can go ahead and participate in the title and abstract screening, for instance. So that's worth noting that you can do that. And this is the screen where you can send out those invitations and check on the status of those invitations as well. As we move through to the center options here, the team settings, there's not much here in terms of settings to look at. Right now, there's absolutely no references to screen, or nothing's been done in this particular project, but this is where you can see progress at the different phases. And it's kind of interesting, as especially on a team where there's a lot of reviewers, you can see who's pulling their weight and who might not be pulling their weight. This is a great option to say, hey, Patrick, you've got about a week to start screening. You better log into Covidence and get going. So this is where you'll see each person's progress. And it's sort of interesting if you have a bit of a competitive side to see who's winning in terms of how many references they've screened. As we move again further right, we're looking now at eligibility criteria. This example here, you can see in sort of the center of the screen that it addresses, or it talks about, the PCOS framework. We did talk about that when we talked about question formulation in the context of scoping reviews. We tend to favor the PCC model, which is population, concept, and context. Here for the PCOS example, another nod here to the limitations or to the reality of Covidence being set up more in the context of systematic reviews. So if you were to scroll down on this page, you would see population, intervention, comparator, and outcomes as part of the list of eligibility criteria, where you can add elements to include and exclude for each of those PICO elements. You can leave this blank, all of this information, but it's there if you need it. What I did highlight on the screen are the highlights and full text reason boxes. If you were to click on highlights, this is what would pop up, and you can add key terms here to the list for items that will be, or for keywords that tend to favor the inclusion criteria, and maybe add keywords that favor the exclusion criteria. This will make more sense once we go live into Covidence, and I can show you how to turn on the highlights. But essentially, this will highlight words in your titles and abstracts in green for the inclusion ones, in red for the exclusion ones. So it makes it visually more obvious if your keywords are there or not in the titles or abstracts. And you can obviously personalize this with many more words if you need to. Now, the full text reasons, we'll come back to those a little later in the video, but this is where you can also go and set them up. So once you've gone through the process of establishing your settings in the Covidence environment, you'll then go back and run your searches in the different databases, and you'll be at the point now where you can start thinking about importing your references. What's important here to remember is, as you run your searches, you try to do them, if you can, on the same day or within a few days in between, if you can, to capture the state of the literature at that point in time. Once you've run your searches, you need to, in the databases, find an option that allows you to save them or to export them so that you can then bring them into your Covidence project. The format that you want to look for is the RIS format. This is a universal format for citation managers like Zotero and EndNote, and most systematic review tools out there rely on RIS as a format to import the references that you've found across the different databases. Now, most databases will have this option available, so if you can, try to locate where and how to export in the RIS format. And again, this is where librarians can come in and help if you have questions around exporting, because it will be different from one database to the next, or I should say from one platform to the next. Also very important, be sure to include the abstract when you're exporting. Not all databases include the abstract by default, so when you're actually on the export page, make sure that you can check off to include the abstract if that's an option, because otherwise you'll only end up with the title in Covidence, which makes it impossible to screen. Now, there are workarounds for certain databases, especially for smaller niche databases, also including French language databases like Érudit and Cairn. They don't have a really easy way of exporting results, and I typically use a workaround either through Zotero or through other means to try to get the abstracts out of the database in a bulk format, and then being able to import those into Covidence. So once you've done this across each database, you return to your Covidence project and you'll be able to import those. The best way to do that is to go to the main page of your review. There will be an import button. You will click on that button. This is the screen you will see. You'll be able to choose at which stage you want to import that RIS file. So by default, the one you want to choose is probably the screening step. That's equivalent to the title and abstract evaluation. So choose to import into the screening process or the screening phase. You can then choose to identify the source. So which database are these references coming from? There's a link there that you can see that allows you to manage the sources. The list that's there is pretty heavy on health-related databases like Medline, Embase, Cochrane Central, etc. If you're in the social sciences and education or in other fields, you might want to customize that list by adding the databases that you've used, and then you can choose that source as an option. Why is this important? When you're going to produce your Prisma diagram, which we'll talk about as well in video 4, you'll be able to see from which database how many results you had from each database. So it can be helpful for the Prisma diagram to have that information. Once that's selected, you can then go ahead and browse your computer to find the file and choose it, and then click on the import button. And we're going to take a bit of a pause here before moving on in terms of Covidence, just to talk a bit about the importance of pilot testing at different phases of your project. You want to set up a pilot test for your titles and abstract screening. The pilot test serves different purposes, but the main purpose is to make sure that everyone on the team understands the inclusion, the exclusion criteria, and applies those consistently when they're reviewing titles and abstracts. So what I usually do as a librarian for research teams, I will typically find 20 random references in one of the main databases on their list. And so in an example here, we could choose from Education Source 20 random references. I usually export the title and abstract, reformat that into an Excel spreadsheet, and I just keep that information, title, abstract, no author information, no date information, just those two fields in two separate columns. My third column, usually in the spreadsheet, is a drop-down yes or no that reviewers can choose from. And then there's a fourth column, which is a notes column where the reviewer can add comments. For instance, they weren't sure or they had questions about a specific reference. They can add that commentary in the Excel spreadsheet. This Excel spreadsheet, there's a master that gets sent out to everyone on the team, and everyone will screen independently those 20 different random references. And then there'll be a consolidation of the results. Everyone will send back their file, and you can then have a discussion around the votes across those 20 references to make sure that everyone's pretty much on the same page when it comes to voting yes or no. If there are references that have very different results in terms of the yes or no vote, there can be obviously a discussion. Again, the idea behind the pilot test is to make sure everyone's on the same page, also to minimize the number of conflicts that might happen once you get back to Covidence and start your official screening phase. So in addition to to pilot testing the titles and abstract, you might also want to pilot test the full text articles. So I'm stepping ahead here. We're going to go back to Covidence and show how we can use Covidence to screen titles and abstract. But once that step is finished, the results that move forward to the full text phase also need to be evaluated. And it's a good idea here as well to evaluate maybe a random sample. I go usually with 3 to 5 references. And again, I'll prepare an Excel spreadsheet, usually at this point just with the title and a link to the full text. The third column usually in that spreadsheet is again, a drop down with the exclusion reasons. And so at this stage, you're not just voting yes or no. If you decide that this article is not relevant, you need to explain or select a specific reason for excluding it. And that list of exclusion criteria can obviously be based on your research question. And typically what you want to do is you want to order it from the easiest reason to assign to the hardest one. Let me explain that a bit more. Let's say in your project, you decide that you're only including articles in English or French. No one else on the team reads other languages, and that's a criteria that you decide is important. Well, that's really easy to assess, right? So sometimes a reference might have gone through the abstract screening because many databases will translate abstracts from other languages into English. But at this stage, you realize once you open the PDF that it's in a language other than English or French. So it's easy. You just open it up. You realize that that's the case. The easiest thing to do is select it because it's the wrong language. Another one could be also in terms of publication type. Let's say a criteria is to include only empirical articles and not include editorials or commentaries. And again, once you open up a document, you see that it is a commentary. You can exclude based on wrong publication type and so on. So then you go into the easiest things to assess to the harder ones because they require more time to look. So once that's done, again, in the pilot test, you're going to be screening this independently. Again, consolidating the choices. If there is a need to conduct a second round of testing, that's definitely possible as well in the context of the full text screening. This one's a little trickier to do again because you want to make sure everyone understands the exclusion reasons. But also, once you vote, you also want to minimize conflicts here too, because even if 2 people decide this article is irrelevant, they vote to exclude, but they choose different reasons, that also creates a conflict. So again, just making sure everyone's on the same page. So now we're at the point where I'm going to jump back into Covidence and we're going to go ahead and check to see how we can use the tool to evaluate the titles and abstracts. So once we're in our project, essentially a couple things. So if you click on the Covidence logo here in the upper left-hand corner, you're basically going to go back to your main page with a list of all the review projects you've created in the tool. If you click on the name of the review, it'll bring you back to the main page, which is this one for this particular review. So this is your review summary page. Remember earlier I mentioned that you can go in and change the settings. Those are here. The import options is right here. That's where you can click and find the import steps to bring in an RIS file. Once you have things in, then you'll see them sort of in this area here in the title and abstract screening area. This is how many references I have in this particular example. So the easiest thing to do is just to click on continue. And from here, you're going to see this screen, which is just a listing of the articles. Now, the default sorting order is by most relevant, which I have a hard time understanding how Covidence determines that. If you want, what I often do is I recommend that you change this to author. The reason being that as you're screening through, you might notice, oh, hang on, I just saw that one. The next one is very similar. It's actually a duplicate. Now, when you import references, duplicates are automatically removed, but there are some that will find their way through. And so if you identify those as you're screening, there is a duplicate button at the bottom of each reference that you can click on, and that will move that one to the duplicates list. Now, what we're seeing on the screen is the title, a bit about the reference itself, and then the abstract. We're also seeing here on the right-hand side a series of 3 buttons: no, maybe, and yes. The maybe button, I encourage all teams to just ignore, because essentially voting maybe is the same thing as voting yes. You're not sure by reading the abstract, you need to see the full text. So in order to minimize conflicts, just stick to yes and to no. So clicking on either button at the bottom or the top here as you're reading through your titles and abstracts. Now, before we start voting, just a few other things to point out. There are other options here that you can use on the screen. So one thing is that there is a notes option. So I can click on notes and add a note for this particular reference. So if I'm not sure about something, or if I want to comment on this one and not have that comment lost, I can add a note to it. I can also select a reference and tag it. So there's a series here of 2 tags that are there by default, and I can add other tags as well. So for instance, if you read the abstract, this is not a good example, but you realize, let's say it's another review article and you don't want to include that in your final set, but you don't want to lose sight of it because you might want to cite it in the intro. You can create a tag, good for intro or something like that. And so you can just type that in, tag it, and it will be easily found later on. Now, also here is the highlights button. So if I click on show highlights, it's going to highlight those keywords that I put in the include column, so in green. And if I had keywords that were from my exclude column, they would appear highlighted in red. So that can be helpful as you're screening through a reference to sort of see where your keywords appear. Now, once you're done setting things up for your screening, you can then go ahead and read the abstract, determine if it's relevant or not, and then click no or maybe. Sorry, no or yes. Skip the maybe. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a couple. As you do one, the next one sort of slides up and allows you to have a look at that one and vote as well. Now, when you're screening titles and abstracts, you get in the habit very quickly of voting no a lot, because a lot of times 95% of what you're going to see is not relevant. And so you're going to be clicking no, no, no. And then sometimes you'll inadvertently say, uh-oh, maybe I did want to include that one. There is an undo button for the very last one that you reviewed. So not 3 references ago, but the last one you just did. You can undo that vote and change your decision. So I'm going to go ahead and just click on a few no's here just to get a few done. Let's add a couple more as you're going through. And so you keep going like that, and that's pretty much it. I mean, the mechanics of using this is pretty straightforward. Nothing too earth-shattering here in terms of the way this is set up. Now, if you want to go back and see your progress, you can click on the name of your review in the upper section of the page. And then you're going to see here that I've done 7. I went ahead and modified my settings, by the way, so that there's only 1 reviewer per reference for this example. I have 34 that are left. I said no to 3 of them, so those have been moved over to the irrelevant pile. And I have 4 that have been moved to the full text review stage. So if I expand this area here, I'm going to see that appear now. Now, again, because I'm the only reviewer on this project, I will have 0 conflicts. But if there are conflicts, that number obviously will change, and there will be a section here on the page which will allow me to go ahead and review those conflicts. So just be aware that that's also possible in the system. If I scroll down to the next part and I click on continue here for the full text review, I will see the articles in a different way on this particular page. Now, magically, when you're here, the results will not suddenly have the full text appear. This is, again, where you can get advice from your librarians on how best to add content to your articles. If an article is available in open access from an open access journal or from a repository, and Covidence was able to fetch it and add it, you will see that underneath the reference, you will see here, instead of upload full text, you'll have a link to the PDF. It will have been added automatically. Now, this is fairly new in Covidence, and it's very helpful, obviously, to help save a bit of time. Now, in other cases, which is the case for this first reference, I would need to go ahead and find the full text for this and add it to the project. I could spend another 15 minutes just explaining the different nuances or the different ways of finding full text to add to Covenants. So again, if you do have questions around that process, please reach out to your librarian. You might have noticed in the upper corner here that there's a bulk upload for missing full text. That is also part of the process. Again, I won't go through that. It's not a button you magically click and it will automatically bulk upload everything. It's a step that requires you to download the references from the full text phase into an RIS format. You can then use Zotero to fetch certain articles, export stuff from Zotero, and bring that back in as an upload into your Covenants project. So again, saving you a bit of those details, but if you run across a review, or if you're working on a review and you get to this phase, please reach out to a librarian. So essentially here, the difference is that you don't have a yes or no button. So once you open up the full text, you have a look at it, you evaluate it, and you determine, okay, this is to include or to exclude. You can basically click one of those two buttons. So if I click on include, this one gets obviously shift over to the next phase, which is data extraction. Not a big deal. Let's say we read this full text article and we decide that this is not relevant. We can click on the exclude button, and this is where we need to choose a reason. So remember earlier we were talking about setting up exclusion reasons from the easiest to assess to the hardest. Well, if you structure your drop-down list in that fashion, then you can sort of see here some examples for this project. So not in English or French, not an empirical article. The context is not elementary or secondary school. And the last one, which just might be harder to assess, it doesn't really address academic achievement. So in our example, we went from very easy to a bit harder to assess and requiring a bit more time to read or sift through the article and find whether or not it addresses academic achievement. So let's pretend this one is not empirical. So we'll click on that option and confirm that choice. And then we go on and we proceed with the next ones as well. So I'll just click on include for that one, and let's exclude this one as well and choose that it's not in an elementary or secondary setting. And if we go back to our main page, we now have moved a few references in and around, and we've got our 3 irrelevant from earlier, our 2 that have been excluded here, and now our 2 studies that are ready for data extraction. Again, we'll address that in the 4th video. So in a nutshell, this is how you can use Covenants to screen your titles and abstracts and your full text articles. I also wanted to quickly talk about using Covenants on a mobile device. So whether on a smartphone or a tablet, there's no app that you can download, but if you go on your browser on either a tablet or phone, you go to the Covenants website, the site will resize and reformat itself for a mobile device. And this is what it would look like in the context of using Covenants on your phone. So as you can see here, you have the title of your review at the top, and you have here the example of the title and the abstract with your yes and no button at the bottom. There is a 3-dot button there too to access maybe and also other features, like for instance, turning on highlights, which I think you can do also on the mobile version of the Covenants website. Now, I often joke around that this is like a dating app for systematic or scoping reviews, because as you vote yes or no, the next reference sort of swipes in, and that's just librarian humor, I guess, but there you go. You have that as an example to remember when you're using Covenants on your phone. So this is great if you're using public transit, if you're heading out on a trip and you have lots of time to wait. You can use this without lugging out your laptop or working on a computer. It's very great. It's very useful for screening references at the title and abstract phase. Very, very useful. Conflicts are unavoidable. Even if you do your pilot test and all 20 references, everyone voted the same way, you're still going to end up with conflicts in your project. And there are different approaches to resolving conflicts based on the methodological guidance. Obviously, this will be unique to each team, depending on how many members you have, how the team is set up. If there's a PI that did not do any reviewing, they might be the ones resolving conflict. So you can really determine how conflicts will be resolved. This is An important part to consider at the beginning, just to have that discussion about how are we going to resolve conflicts in our project. You can have a discussion among your team members. So if you have a team, let's say of 4 reviewers, you can all sit together, look at the conflicts, have a discussion, and make an informed decision on whether to include or not. You can do it with a third person evaluating. So I've been on a team, for instance, where we are a team of 4 reviewers, and we were all responsible for resolving conflicts where we were not part of the conflict. So the reference, for instance, was reviewed by 2 other people. I wasn't part of that review, so I can go ahead and make a decision. You will see who reviewed a title or abstract or a full text, but you will not see their decision until you make a final choice. So you want to minimize the fact that you're not being influenced when making a final decision. So again, this is stuff you would want to report in your methods to say conflicts were resolved following this particular approach. So all in all, this is how you will tackle the mountain of evidence that you'll find depending on your review question if you have lots of references or a smaller set of references if you're on a smaller review project. But I think these are the key points to remember from this particular video. So try to run your searches on the same day. Also take time to understand database-specific export options. They will be different from platform to platform, so make sure that you find out how to do that and how to do it successfully as well. Certain databases will have limits on the number of references you can export at once, so you might have to do it in batches. Also take time to explore the different settings in Covenants once you set up your project. Don't just go right ahead and import. Make sure that you look at the different options that are available to personalize the experience or personalize your review. Also running pilot tests. Again, it seems like it may be an extra step to take. Guidance is really key on running these pilot tests. So if you can, spend a bit of time setting that up and making sure that everyone's on the same page. And finally, as I end all of these videos, consult with your librarian if you have any specific questions about evaluating titles and abstracts, about screening full text articles, finding full text, or any other things that were mentioned as part of this video.